welcome to My Faculty Podcast at Walden University, created to provide further professional development and conversations relevant to faculty interests. This podcast is brought to you by the Office of Research and Doctoral Services. With me today are Leilani Gjelstadt and Sri Banerjee. Why don't we start with you guys introducing yourself, Leilani?
Hello, I'm Leilani Gjelstadt, and I serve as the chair of the Institutional Review Board at Walden University. That's the entity that does the ethics reviews for research studies before data collection.
And Sri?
Hi, I'm Dr. Sri Banerjee, core faculty for the College of Health Sciences at Walden University. At Walden, I teach full-time several courses in the public health department, and I also serve as chair, committee member, and university research reviewer for doctoral level students.
Great. Over the next two podcasts, we're going to take a look at using social media in research. And today's topic is using social media for recruitment. Sri, what's your experience with this?
Thanks, Lee, for that question. Recruitment, first of all, I would like to say is a very critical aspect of conducting a study. Sometimes we get so involved in going through the trees and looking at the very minutia and detail, we lose sight of some of the bigger picture and some of the bigger themes that are important. So what are some things that are happening in recruiting? Well, you're trying to appeal to a larger audience why they should be taking your questionnaire, taking your survey. And this is their first sneak peek into kind of understanding the reasons why this survey might be, important. So while it may be important to keep this description brief, it's also crucial that you make sure that the recruitment message is such that it complies with all of the necessary elements needed to introduce into a research study. So brevity is of course key, but also making sure the literacy level is at the appropriate level as who will be taking your questionnaire. And so typically when I was doing some grant research and recruitment in that, the principle that I used and my collaborators used was about, anywhere from 6th to 8th grade level education. So these are some of the initial guiding principles in recruitment.
Sri, do you know how someone might measure that as to what the grade level is of a particular piece of writing?
That's a very good question, Lee. There are actually certain health literacy and literacy assessment tools which can be found on the internet pretty easily. And so some of these literacy assessments are basic literacy level to assessing literacy and assessing knowledge over specific diseases like diabetes. So there are a whole host and whole range of literacy assessment tools which you can search for and find within the internet.
Awesome.
And if I could add something, Microsoft Word has a built-in reading level assessment. It's the Fleisch-Kincaid, I'm not sure if that's how you say it, Fleisch-Kincaid. And it's part of the settings where you can ask it Word to check your grammar. And if you check also give me readability statistics, it'll give you the approximate grade level at which your material is written. And that's very helpful. It's not perfect, but it's a guide, and it can, tell you, well, you've written everything at a 12th grade level, so you probably need to take it down. And some of the pragmatic suggestions for how you can write at a simpler grade level. Some people respond really well if you say, think about USA Today. It's one of those publications that does tend to write at a more of a 5th to 7th grade reading level. Try to avoid using the passive voice. Also try to avoid compound sentences and words that are more than 3 syllables long. And I mean, that's pretty difficult to do, to be honest, but it's just, these are some of the things you could try to do if you're trying to keep materials at, like Sri was saying, maybe a 6th grade reading level or thereabouts.
Very good. So Leilani, are there ethics issues that we should keep in mind with social media?
You know, the beautiful thing about social media is that everyone who's participating in social media is doing so voluntarily. They're already there of their own free will. It's very different from collecting data in someone's workplace or in their school or in their doctor's office, where there are more power relationships. Social media is, for better or worse, one of the great equalizers. And if somebody doesn't like what someone else is doing, they just sort of disengage and walk away. And so from a formal perspective, from a university perspective, we don't usually require documentation, like written permission, to recruit participants in social media. You just follow essentially the policies of, Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or LinkedIn. Sometimes we forget that LinkedIn is actually a form of social media. And if you follow those policies, and then if you're going to recruit within certain groups, like special interest groups that might be set up, say within Facebook, they have interest groups where people can post rules that everyone agrees to when they enter the group. And in some cases, there might be rules against any type of solicitation. And believe it or not, even though you're not really trying to sell anyone anything, in some of these policies, research invitations would be considered solicitation. But most of the time they're talking about don't try to sell us anything. So you just have to read the fine print. And if you're in doubt, just ask the administrator of the group, would you have any objection to me sharing this type of flyer? And typically the response is either no, there's no objection, or well, if you do it, I'd like to be able to frame it this way, or, and so either way, it's a good discussion to have. And some groups in some context, you can just freely post. And I would say the main ethical concern is ensuring that you as a user really understand what's being posted publicly versus what's being sent as direct messaging. Every once in a while, there are people out there who don't fully understand the difference between privately messaging someone in social media and publicly posting. And it tends to be people who don't use it that often, or maybe they just are pretty new to the setting and they don't understand that there's some things that you might comment on that everybody can see versus other, direct messaging is something only the people on the message can see. And so for the more sensitive studies, we would say we would work individually with each researcher. The IRB would work with the researcher to ensure that if there are any elements, let's say the topic of the study is stigmatizing, like if it were about, suicidal ideation or, part of something for ex-offenders where there's might be a slightly stigmatizing element or a very stigmatizing element of the study, that the recruitment could be handled, that you could still do snowball sampling, you could still do posting to groups, but then as people are volunteering, that those types of communications be handled one-on-one rather than having people, say, responding to a thread, publicly to volunteer. In general, in research, recruiting people in a group setting can be it's just not private. And so therefore some of the other issues with either power dynamics or just loss of privacy can come up. And so we would encourage researchers to just be very sensitive about which things they're posting publicly, which things they might direct message about. And then also to be very clear when they're discussing with the participants how the results of the study will eventually be shared. Usually it works best to share the results of the study in the same format in which the invitation was put out there. So for example, if you posted an invitation in a special interest group, maybe parents of children with autism, and you collect your data and you analyze your data and you've got these great findings you want to share. Typically, if you recruited the adult, let's say it's a survey and it was an anonymous survey, then it would be ideal for you not to email it would be ideal for you to not ask for email addresses of individual participants. If your goal is to provide anonymity, then you should just share the results in the same way that you initially posted the invitation. So maybe just posting the results to the entire group, and it would presumably be seen by essentially the same set of people who saw the invitation. And that's a little different compared to a situation where if you were conducting a study that's not anonymous and you might ask them for their email address, or you might say, I'm going to message you the results later, that, I know who you are essentially, and I'm going to follow up with you. Those are both acceptable paths, either the anonymous route or the I know who you are and I'm going to be following up with you specifically later. But then they have different considerations, considering the risk level of the study and the privacy of the issues, related to the data collection. And then certainly you don't want to somehow accidentally, you don't want to post the results and then tag the people who were the participants or something like that. So I think any researcher considering using social media for recruitment and for results dissemination needs to make sure they really understand the platform very well. And I don't recommend that novice users of these platforms use them for recruitment.
Have you had any experience with people buying ads on Facebook to recruit people?
I think we've had a few. It's a little more common if a researcher is going to spend money, and it's usually not an insignificant amount of money. It's a little more common for a researcher to use one of the services that connects researchers, academic researchers and marketing researchers, with people who are willing to take surveys. And there are quite a few of those services out there. So I hesitate to name one or another because they change and they seem to evolve a lot. But we certainly have encountered, one common one is SurveyMonkey. I think a lot of people are aware that SurveyMonkey is a platform that you can use to host your online survey, but they also have a service by which you can essentially buy participants. You can ask SurveyMonkey, okay, can you find me 100 parents of children with autism? And they can do that because they have panels of people who've already volunteered essentially to be part of SurveyMonkey's system for distributing surveys. And most of the time they're either paid directly for each survey they take, or they get a donation to a charity of their choice for every survey they take. And there are panelists all over the world, and whatever your inclusion criteria are, they often will just say, okay, here's the price for that set of criteria. And the more difficult it is to meet your criteria, the higher the price is. I think I encountered one student who was going to be asked to pay something along the lines of $50 per survey response because the criteria were so very specific. The participants had to be from another particular country in a very narrow age bracket with a certain small range of experiences. It's much more common for the cost per survey to be something like 50 cents to $2 per survey. That's definitely more the normal range that we've been seeing.
I think I don't want to go down a rabbit hole with this. I think this is a topic for a whole nother podcast. But do either of you have recommendations for how to best do an ad that somebody might want to post on social media?
Well, Lee, I actually also before talking about some of the recommendations, I wanted to revisit some of the interesting aspects that Leilani was describing. Just quickly, the literacy portion of it, and talking about the Fleisch-Kincaid reading level. That is a very, very good practical tool. Again, a part of Word. I also wanted to introduce another, a part of the National Institute of Health. they have, when doing health literacy sort of assessments, the Office of Communications and Public Liaison, they have a sort of clear communication initiative. So it's really important and interesting area to assess for literacy. The other portion of the differentiating between, direct messaging, private messaging versus publicly posting. I personally encountered that in the social change grant that I was conducting over 2021 regarding, looking for associations between COVID-19 and looking for anxiety. And so we had to go through a recruitment process and all of that. And one thing that struck me and my collaborators by surprise was the number of public messages that people were posting that were more geared towards private sentiment and opinion. And something as sensitive as COVID-19, there were varied opinions, including ones that questioned the veracity of the very pandemic. And so it was important, now that we know this type of thing can occur, it's important for researchers to prepare for things. So in summary, I think thinking about all of the things, brevity, of course, readability, all of these things are important. Those can't be emphasized enough. But in addition, having something where you can provide respondents with results, right? A feature where you can do that. I think follow-up, throughout this process is extremely important, and to understand that recruitment is it's not just one thing, but it's part of a whole process of research.
And I would also add that sometimes as a researcher, you do just need to take a huge step back and maybe ask some friends and family who are not in grad school to look at your invitation and just kind of talk you through what their impressions are. What would they think if they saw this as they were scrolling through social media, or what would they think if this landed in their inbox? If some researchers do choose to directly inbox people, like especially with LinkedIn, you might inbox people who meet certain criteria. And I think that does a lot, but some of the types of feedback that lay people might have for you are, too many words. Too many words. For example, you definitely won't include citations in a research invitation, though that's the way we scholars speak to one another. It's very distracting and busy looking for people who are not in grad school or working in academia. No citations. I would recommend, it's not required, but I would recommend that you use bullets instead of complete sentences and paragraphs. It's just easier for someone to skim. And like Sri said, to keep it very brief and to the point, always knowing that if they do click on the survey, they're going to see an extensive consent form. They're going to see more information. And really your initial invitation is just to make them aware of the study and, so they can assess, is this a fit for me? Is this something I would be interested in? And another thing I would say is kind of in that middle ground in between, somewhere between the invitation and the consent process. If you suspect that your population is not that familiar with academic research, and let's say you're doing interviews, and if you just say, I'm doing interviews of people about COVID, a lot of people might assume you're a journalist or assume you're a documentarian unless you specify that you're a researcher. That's one of those real basic things that sometimes people don't think to say, I'm a researcher, and they just say, I'm looking for people to interview, and the people seeing it think, oh, this is probably for TV or some documentary being made. And there's nothing wrong. If people have a little confusion, you can help clear that up. But what's really, I think, going to make a big difference and has an ethical dynamic to it is that when people are interviewed in journalism and for documentaries, often their identity is attached to their stories and their their interview. And to the extent of, a lot of times when we see news interviews, the person's name is written right underneath, on the screen, or their position maybe of where they work. And so what's very different about social science research, and is very surprising to many people who aren't familiar with academic research, is when you tell them, I'm keeping your identity confidential, and I actually will not be saying your name. I am not really in a position to publicly thank you for your contribution to this research, and here's why. We're looking for to look for, say, themes in people with similar experiences, and this is not about a one person story. And I think that it's tricky. I think that you can do this fairly concisely when you're in your invitation by just saying, the phrase confidential interview. That often conveys that, okay, this is confidential. So that means not everything's going to be out in the open. And then later on, when you get to explaining it to them a bit more, you could say more. And if they seem to not get it, why don't you want to use my name? Or why don't you, want to use, video record me and have my face be attached to, and then you could just say, well, here's, in social science research, we often do it this other way. That's a little different. And so often, the IRB will give feedback on these types of things when you submit your flyer, and certainly your committee can give valuable feedback. But don't forget that your family and friends who are not involved in grad school at all can give really helpful feedback from a layperson perspective.
Awesome. Anyone have anything else they think we should tell faculty? All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me today. I know this is going to be something that students and faculty are really going to be able to use. So thank you.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today for Research Talk. Our music is by audionautics.com, and I'm Dr. Lee Stadtlander. Today's podcast was sponsored by Walden University's Office of Research and Doctoral Services.